Hello, this is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Part of our goal here at The Optimistic American is to rekindle the American spirit. We're really excited to have a guest on today, Governor Todd Whitman, who not only was a Republican governor, but she also served in the cabinet of George Bush. Now, here's what's interesting. Christie's involved in an effort, after all those years she spent in the Republican Party, to create a third party. The third party is called the Forward Party, and here's what you're going to find interesting about it. You can be a member, and it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or an unaffiliated voter, because this party is looking to do something very different and very unique. It's looking to change the way that we elect people at the local level. Governor Whitman does a great job of trying to explain the problems in the existing system and why those changes are important. I think you're going to like the show that we have today. If you do, press that subscribe button. It's important for us to know whether or not this is the type of programming that you want. Again, now, on with Todd Whitman and our show. Well, Governor Whitman, I would like to welcome you to the Optimistic American show today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, so here's my big question. Now, you were a lifetime Republican, but actually more than that. You were a superstar in the Republican Party, still are. You were governor of New Jersey. You ended up being a cabinet level official, one of the highest posts that you can get in this country. And yet, you're forming a third party. You're chairman of a new organization that is effectively a third party. I know that you give up political capital to make that happen. You lose some friends along the way. You're taking a risk, and I want to know, why are you taking that risk, and why do you think this is important?
Well, it was an easy decision, actually, for me. I am so worried about our democracy and the way I see our politics going. The fact that, you look at what's going on in Washington today, and they spend time in the Congress arguing over Barbie. We have serious problems, and people will not. Right now, the partisanship has gotten so strong that people just don't want to talk to one another, and it is not serving the American people well. And actually, what we've fallen into is what our founding fathers warned us about. They warned us about parties. They didn't like them. Benjamin Franklin, when asked what kind of a government they'd given us, famously said, a republic if you can keep it, because they were concerned that political parties would start to, and loyalty to those parties would start to supersede good policy and discussions, that it would be more about the party than it would be about solving problems. And that's where we are today. So that's why Andrew and I and Michael Wilner came together from three separate organizations to try to offer the people really a way to get power back in their hands by changing how we choose our elected officials. And it's interesting, you know this well, having been an elected official, it's a serving time, that when people say party, they assume immediately certain things. And one of those is, well, what's your platform? Where do you stand on abortion? Where do you stand on guns? We're not like that. At the national level, we're a party of principles. And we say, if you want to be a forward member, there's some things to which you have to agree. You have to agree to uphold the rule of law, respect the Constitution, be willing to solve problems by working with others across the aisle, and be willing to work to change the way that we choose our candidates, to break the hold of the two parties so that people have more choices. There are 500,000 elective offices across the country, and in any given year, 70% of those are uncontested. And of those, 5 to 10% are never filled. And our feeling is that we need to, everybody should have a choice, and all offices should be filled. But it should be up to the states to decide, is abortion really the number one issue for Arizona? Are guns really the number one issue that people worry about day in and day out in Maine? It's going to be different issues, and we want to have a space for candidates who will speak to their constituents on the issues of importance to those constituents and give them a pathway to getting elected.
Yeah, the majority leader we had on, Republican from Alaska, And one of the things she said was she really wasn't in favor of the top four when it passed, but she said it's amazing to watch not only how people get along, but how the issues have changed. She said before,
Right.
the big issues were issues about who can use what bathrooms and the pro-life, pro-choice issue. And she said not that those aren't important. She says, but the change that's happened today is that now they're talking about education, infrastructure, and economic development. It changes the priorities when people have a different type of system. So let's talk about that system for a moment. You made, I think, a great point. I think you said 500,000 positions that are elected in the country. 70% of them are uncontested. When you look at that and you boil that down to a number, somewhere around 80% of our country is a registered voter. But today, 40% in America are, according to Gallup, they consider themselves non-affiliated. They're not part of a party.
Right.
Well, that means you have about 30% Democrat, 30% Republican. Times that by the 80% that are registered, you end up with about 24% in either party. However, the turnout is only about 30 to 35%. That means you're really only getting 6 to 8% of the people showing up in that primary. And with that happening, I'm a registered independent, and I enjoy being a registered independent. But I realize one of the unintended consequences of that is there's less moderate voices voting in those primaries. They've become more extreme in the last 10 years, much more extreme. And if you poll either side of them, the people who vote in those primaries, they don't even represent the people who would vote in the general election inside that party. It's
Exactly.
dramatically different.
It is. It's totally different because people in the primaries, first of all, we got ourselves into this position by taking our democracy for granted and not bothering to vote in primaries because it was a nice day and we wanted to play golf, or it was a lousy day and we didn't want to go out. This has been a pattern now for years where you had average voter turnout in primaries at 10 to the most 15%, which means you have the most partisan people who tend to be the most ideological choosing the choices for November, and then people go to the polls. I don't like either of these choices. Pox on both your houses. I'm not going to vote in general elections. And that's just wrong. But now we're at a place where there are tools out there to return the power back to the people and to break up the duopoly of the two major parties, Republican and Democrat. They hate ranked choice voting for the most part because they don't know who's going to win. And what it does is it says to someone, if you live in a district that's a solid red district and you're a Democrat, you haven't bothered to vote because it wasn't going to make a difference. Now it will make a difference. And it does change the candidates. First of all, you don't have all that nasty stuff because everyone wants to be liked. You want to be at least the second choice of everybody, even if they don't make you your first choice. You want to be the second choice. And so you don't do the nastiness. You don't want to be hated. And you talk about those issues that are relevant to your voters. So it's a whole different dynamic that we believe, and we've seen it. And as you mentioned, even in Alaska, Republican leaders are recognizing how important it is to get people to energized, to feel it makes a difference to vote, and to get the issues that are important up there talked about. And that's how Mary Patola, who's the first Native Alaskan elected to Congress, a Democrat, in a really Republican state, was able to beat Sarah Palin because she was telling us that she'd be in a parade and she'd see a Palin sign and she'd say, "Good choice, but make me number 2." And that's what happened. Sarah got her base out, but she didn't get enough votes to make it to the next round. And a lot of her voters' second place choice was Mary. And so that's what happens. And we know Lisa Murkowski never would have made it back to the Senate if she'd had a Republican primary because she voted for impeachment. When you think of the return rate to Congress is somewhere between 95 and 98%. And yet of the 10 Congress people who voted, Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, only 2 made it back. And that was under sort of different circumstances in voting. When you think of that return rate and you think how many of them did not make it back, it tells you that party loyalty has become so strong and you have to stay with the party that you don't think for yourself. After my reelect for governor, I was asked and pushed by the party to run for the Senate. which was not something I was particularly interested in, but I said I'd go down and talk to the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. And this was back, when did I get reelected? 1997. So this was 1998. And I went down and met with the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, and I was told point blank that if I said one word about campaign finance reform, I wouldn't get a penny from them. And that's what's happening. Our elected officials are so scared of losing the support of their parties, and they're forced to confront issues that they may not think, really, is Barbie all that important in a country like ours? But those are the issues they have to talk about, and they're told what positions they have to take.
Yeah, those positions are safe positions if the only people voting for you are the extremes who actually vote in the partisan primaries. And as you said, in 70% of the cases, that's the only voters they face. All right, so I want to talk about the reforms, but before I talk about the actual reforms, I'd like to talk to you or ask you, again, you were a Republican governor. You ended up being in a cabinet. I'd like to know why you selected the Republican Party. Why were you in the Republican Party at all in the beginning?
I was born and raised in it. In fact, my parents were introduced to one another at the 1932 Republican National Convention. I think I was a Republican in the womb. At age 13, I did what most teenagers do and questioned my parents and why am I a Republican? And the more I thought about it, the Republican Party back then had some simple principles that you respect the individual. And one of the ways you respect the individual is less government intrusion in their everyday life. There's a responsibility to keep taxes as low as possible so people can keep what they earn. But that means you have to keep budgets under control. You have to balance budgets. We believed in solving problems closest to the people, working from the ground up rather than, because of its enormous reach, going immediately to the federal government to solve problems and make decisions top down. And those things were things with which I was very comfortable, and I was comfortable as a governor. But when I wrote my book in 2005, It's My Party Too, I was talking about what I feared was going to happen and what the trend I'd seen with Republicans of moving further and further to the extreme and eliminating people. My father was a Republican state chairman. My mom had been a Republican National Committee woman and went way back in the family. But when I asked my father what was a political party, and he said they were like umbrellas, that you have the handle, which were shared core principles. But then you had the ribs that held up the canvas under which everybody was. And those ribs were different ways of interpreting those core principles. So it meant you could have a liberal, conservative, and moderate Republican. Nowadays, you can't have that. And the same for the Democrats. You can't have that. You have to be party line. And we're being driven, both parties, by the more extreme elements. And that's not the party in which I grew up. So it was something that I've watched happening. I've seen it happen now for decades. And it's not where I am.
I love the idea of you focusing on the individual. I believe our government has done a great many things. We've built dams and bridges. We've even put people on the moon. But the single greatest thing our government ever did was in the very beginning, it empowered the individual over itself. And that was an incredibly powerful thing. That, to me, seems to be one of the unifying themes. What I see going on the far right with the alt-right is this idea of identifying people based upon their group, right? It's white nationalists who don't like the Jewish community, or they don't like the black community, or what they call the liberal elite, but they identify them by their group. But the same thing's happening on the left when they talk about white patriarchy or white privilege. Again, they're, instead of doing what, the greatest, I think, the greatest lesson we should have gained out of the 60s was from Martin Luther King, who says we should judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And what we see happening on the left is almost the same thing. It's a more radical ideology that is saying, no, we want to identify you by the group that you're in, not by who you are as an individual. And that's the area that I see where independents, non-affiliated voters, and for that matter, a large group of Republicans and Democrats, I think, are finding common ground, which is, no, even though we may have disagreement on issues, We want a society based on the individual.
Right. And it's interesting because I used to get asked a lot, are you conservative or moderate or liberal? And I said, look, tell me what the issue is. I'll tell you where I stand, and then you decide, because I'm going to be in different places on different issues. I tend to be a fiscal conservative and socially inclusive. So I'm one of those that's in the middle. Depending on the issue, I will decide on what I think is in the best interests of people. And that's how I governed, and that's how it worked to get reelected in a very democratic state. But you're right. We're seeing these extremes get ever more extreme and having more power. When Congress is as closely aligned as it is, it makes a difference, and small groups can come together to really influence policy, as we're seeing right now with the House got through a bill for the military, but it's full of social issues that really have nothing to do with the military, and it's imposing a social agenda on the military that never used to happen. And I think there were maybe 3 Democrats who voted for it, and 3 Republicans who did not, and that was it. It was a straight party line. And we being Andrew and I and Michael have talked to current members who will tell you, when they're being honest, that they don't want to solve some of these problems. I mean, they'd rather have the issue because it gets their base ginned up, and that's what they're after. And that's just a huge disservice to the American people and very dangerous. So that's why we're so focused on finding ways to return the power to the individual and make sure that their voice is heard. Because in many states, if you're unaffiliated or an independent, you can't even vote in primaries. And that doesn't make any sense either, particularly military. Many of the military never register because they're not supposed to be political. And when they come out, they're independents. They're registered independents. They vote, but they're registered independents. They don't take a party stance for the most part. And when they come out, they find they can't vote. And in Nevada, actually, they had on the ballot a ranked choice voting initiative last year. And both parties came out hard against it. Particularly Democrats spent a lot of money on it. It passed by over 52%. And one of the telling ads was a retired military who stood up and he said, look, I was overseas, I fought for this country, and now I can't cast a ballot. That's just wrong, because he was an independent, and you can't do that in Nevada.
Yeah, in Arizona, if you're an independent or non-affiliated voter and you decide to run for office, again, if you run for governor, you need 6,000 signatures as a Democrat, 6,000 signatures as a Republican. You need 60,000 if you decide to run without a party affiliation. It's not hard to figure out what they're doing, right? I mean,
right, exactly.
So, if we can just get rid of that entire other group, the majority, we can keep running things through a minority. So your parents were farmers, I believe. Mine were ranchers. I remember once my dad said, I asked him about how something works. He said, if you can't figure out how something works, he says, just follow the money. Well, if you look at the two parties, it's not hard for me to see that these narrow, extreme issues that upset people make them a lot of money. It makes them a lot of money. They don't send out fundraising ads on what we're going to do on infrastructure or on education or on issues that people care about. They pick out these hardline issues and they send out mail on it because it raises money. It helps finance what it is that they're trying to do. But in the process, it's moving forward these divisions in America. And now the news media is caught into the same thing. Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, they've recognized the value of picking a side. And so the goal is terrify us about how the other side is going to do some harm to us, put us into a position where we're terrified and can't think logically. And what are we going to do? Watch tomorrow to see what's going to happen.
Right. It's if we have a problem, it's them. They're the ones that did it to us, and they're the bad people. We've seen this movie before, and it didn't end up well back in the 30s and 40s. I mean, when you start doing that and building those divides and setting people against one another, and it's just not our country. If you talk to people, one thing I have found throughout my career is when you sit people down, if you get people to say, you go to them and say, is this an issue about which you care? Is this an important issue, one that we ought to be addressing? And if they say yes, even though they come at it from diametrically opposed positions, but the issue, they agree on that the issue is something of importance, if you put them in a room, and I've done it a couple of times, it's amazing how they start to talk to one another and come up with solutions that work. Nobody gets everything, but that's the nature of consensus. But they can reach it if you just give them a chance to really sit down and think and talk to one another, somebody who's on the other side, and realize, hey, we all basically want the same thing. We want to be secure in our futures. We want to keep a roof over our heads. We want our children to be well educated so they can do better than we've done. We want peace and security. Those are the things we want. We want to be able to live our lives without interference every day from either side. And we can get there if we create the opportunity for people to come together to talk, which is why at Forward we're so focused on the local elections, because people are beginning to really understand the importance of their school board, the importance of their library commission and their mayor. Those are the ones that are making the decisions that most immediately impact your daily life. And people can feel that, okay, I can get this, and with a new process, I can really get hold of it. Whereas if you tell them we're trying to reform Congress, they'll say, well, good luck with that. That's been tried for years, and you just can't seem to pry the parties loose.
It seems like No Labels is trying to do a top-down approach to
Right.
reform, whereas the Forward Party is trying to do a bottom-up reform. Now, there are two
Exactly.
parts to the reform that you all have been talking about. The first part is trying to open up the primary, and the second part is having some type of ranked choice vote. Why don't we start with the primary? What is it that you believe works or that needs to happen from a primary standpoint to help make us less divided?
Well, actually, if you had ranked choice voting, you wouldn't need primaries. Ranked choice voting would take over from that, which is why that's number one, because it's an instant runoff system too. It would also save states an enormous amount of money, not having to go back and have second elections and recounts over and over again. But in primaries, if you have open primaries so that people can come in and vote, doesn't matter whether they're registered Republican or Democrat, they can vote from wherever they want. Or fusion, which is one of the things we're working on here in New Jersey, which means that a candidate can be endorsed by a number of different parties. So people who are registered as independents, if they get the independent premature, then they can vote for them, or if they're Green Party or whatever, as well as a Democrat or as well as a Republican. So there are different ways of doing it, of opening up the system. We particularly like the ranked choice voting because it does do away with primaries. You don't need a primary when you have a ranked choice voting system. And so that's sort of the cleanest way to do it.
Let me ask a question. So there's semantics sometimes in terms of how people see things, but in city elections, most city elections across the country, you could call it a primary and a general, or you could call it a general and a runoff, but in cities, they interchange those names. But the fundamental issue is, in the first election, everybody runs against one another. There's no party. And then you send forward the top two or the top three or the top four candidates, depending upon what the runoff situation looks like. What would you call that type of primary? To you, is that an open primary, or is that a non-primary? What's the view that you have when everybody runs?
That's an open primary.
Okay.
That's an
Yeah, I know
open
some people
primary.
call an open primary just your ability to vote, the independent's ability to vote inside the
In the
Republican
primaries
primary or the
and to
Democratic
vote
primary.
for a Republican or a Democrat. And again, if you have fusion, sometimes you can vote for more than one, or you see them on different ballot lines, and you can vote for them on those different lines as well. As they're Republican and Green Party, you can vote for them in each of those. But ranked choice voting, what that will do is, if nobody gets to 50.1%, the bottom gets knocked off, and their second place votes get allocated up the ballot. And it depends on how the state sets it up. If they do it the top three or the top five, then you keep going until you have somebody who actually has 50.1% of the public support, which would be a nice thing given that we have minority people in office constantly. I mean, my minority in the sense of their general public backing. They get in with 30% or 32%. So it would be nice to have somebody that had 50.1%, which is the other thing that it does.
Yeah. So by the way, we appreciate the Forward Party's help on Arizona's initiative. The way that we're looking at it is we separate these into two parts, and the first part is getting rid of the parties being in control of the primary itself. That doesn't mean Democrats and Republicans can't run, but they all run against one another. And then what we do is we send the top 2, 3, 4, or 5 forward, depending upon what number ends up being selected. And if it's more than 2, it becomes a ranked choice voting system. Now, I personally support ranked choice voting, and I like top 5. I ran in a top 2 system with an open primary. There's a huge advantage to that. The advantage was when I had to go out and campaign. I had to go talk to Republicans, Democrats, and Independents because they were all going to vote in that primary. And it didn't give me the escape to only address one group. Well, later I ran for governor, and it was so odd to me to be in this partisan primary where the only people that I was really supposed to talk to were Democrats, which, by the way, made it hard for a mayor who had done a lot to try to build a broader consensus amongst people. But let's talk about the ranked choice voting and why having 4 or 5 people, as Alaska does, is better than a top 2. And again, I ran in a top 2. I think there's advantages to it, but I think there are bigger advantages to going to a top 4 or top 5 system.
I would agree with you because it gives people more choices, and it gives you a better opportunity to get someone who really does have 50.1% of support. So I believe it should be more than the 2. And I'm with you. I like 4 or 5. It may slow down the process a little bit because, if nobody gets it to 50.1% on the second, it happens in the third round or the second round. But
do you believe in the argument that it might reduce negative campaighting to have 4 or 5?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you found it when you ran for mayor. You had to talk to everybody. And if you talk to everybody and you want them to support you, particularly if you go on to the second round, you don't want to be seen as a jerk who's just tossing bombs at the other candidates. You really have to say something positive about what you want to do to get people to be willing to rank you at all. I mean, that's the other thing. People don't have to rank. They can, and they will be encouraged that they'll want to, I think. But you absolutely don't have to. If there's only one candidate you think is right, then that's the person you vote for. But it'll stop. What it stops is what we've had so much of, which is voting for the lesser of evils. I don't like either, but this person is a bit better than the other one, so that's who I'll vote for. I think a lot of people are feeling about that as they look at the presidential contest. If it shapes up the way the pundits keep talking about it now, which is, as you know, a lifetime in politics between now and then. But if it's a Biden-Trump election, most of the people are saying, really? In a country of this size, this is the best we can do, irrespective of how much you like them. And I happen to think Biden doesn't get nearly the credit he should for what's happening with the economy and what he's gotten through the bipartisan bills. But be that as it may, it's still, too often we're left with the lesser of evils, and that's not what we want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it can be lost on us that 70% of the public today doesn't want either choice, and part of that may be fair or unfair, but I think it's being driven by a constant negative media, a constant negative primary system, people being divided up into their camps, the tribalism that comes along with partisanship. I had a pollster tell me when I helped run one of the presidential campaigns, the pollster said, look, I was talking about how to reach out into the center during the primary. And the answer was, no, look, here's what we have to do. We have to go terrify our base. And the pollster said, when you get done terrifying them about how bad the other side is and why you're going to protect them, the only thing we need to do in the general is convince them that the other side is worse than us. And I thought, Oh my God, this is a terrible
Well,
system.
when I first ran in 1993, it was a pretty brutal campaign. And I saw Paul Begala, it had been James Carville and Paul Bagata, who had run the campaign of the incumbent against me. And I saw him afterwards, and he said, we don't know how you survived because we wanted people not just not to vote for you, we wanted them to hate you. I mean, that was the attitude. The ads were pretty brutal. I mean, as I said more than once, if all I knew about me was from the ads, I drove drunk every night with an Uzi hanging out the window shooting up watermelons. I mean, I wouldn't vote for me either. But that was that. This has been going on for a while now. It's to brutalize the other person, not to talk about differences in policy or approaches on ways to solve problems. It's to just make you hate or fear the other person getting into office.
Yeah, and the negative part, it's obvious to me when you run in a top two, it's very easy to be negative about the other person. When you run in a top four or five, the old adage of "he who throws mud loses ground" becomes
Right,
true, right? Not only is the person you're throwing mud on going to get hurt, but you're going to get hurt too, and it's going
right.
to go to someone else. So it gets to this idea of, hey, how do we get candidates to talk about aspirational issues as opposed to divisive issues? And there are so many things that we need to be aspirational on to give people hope that we actually can make the problem better.
Well, this is a wonderful country. It's the best in the world. I mean, it's got its flaws, it's made its mistakes, no question about it. I don't have rose tinted glasses that tell me everything's been perfect and always will be, but still, it's the best. It's the best choice I've seen around. And I refuse to let it get dragged down the way we see it getting dragged down. And that's why I think opening up the process is so critically important so that people do have to talk to everybody and they will concentrate more because what that does is it breaks the party's stranglehold on telling them what issues they have to take up and how they have to talk about them and leaves them free to talk about the issues that their constituents, the people whose votes they want, are concerned about. And that's just a whole different world than what we have now. And I don't, not everybody recognizes that, but they will when they are empowered. And I've found, particularly with Forward, when I explain it to people, and it doesn't matter whether it's a firefighter or a taxi driver or a CEO, once they really understand the freedom that it gives them to vote for anybody and the ability to really rank people in their order of choice, they are all in. They really like it, and they understand something has to be done because we're not getting the kind of of government we need or want. We're not getting the issues solved.
Couple of questions. In Arizona, one of the things that our legal group has told us is that it's very difficult for this to affect presidential elections. We may have to stay removed from it. Have you seen any group that's looking at changing the actual way that the presidential primary works?
Well, we're not, as I said, Forward is not involved in that. Forward is
Mm-hmm.
talking about, we're in it for the long run and we're building from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? If we can elect enough people at the local level who are supporting things like ranked choice voting, you don't have to have 100% of a legislature to
That's
make
right.
a difference. You only need a small nucleus, depending on the side of your legislature. But I mean, look at the difference Joe Manchin has made in the Senate last year, or did in the Senate. I mean, whether you like what he did or not, he affected a whole lot of bills as one person. So it's going to take longer to really impact the presidential to change that. I believe it's going to take longer, but with the kind of work that we're doing, if we can, we've got this cycle, we've got 2024. By 2028, we can be in a pretty good place to change how the presidential primaries go, and how people, the kind of opportunity that people have to hear from real candidates who care about the issues.
So, one of the things that I think is going to happen is that this ranked choice voting and open primaries actually begins to change the parties themselves. I don't believe it eliminates them from the process, but it changes what they have to address to be successful. What's
Mm-hmm.
your thought on this? At the end of the day, does ranked choice voting and open primaries destroy the political parties and they go away, or do they just change the types of subjects that they're talking about?
Well, I'm hopeful it'll change the parties too. I was someone who was obviously brought up in the two party tradition. I think there's room and need for a third party anyway.
Hmm.
because even though they may change because they see the pressure to change the issues they're addressing, that's not getting at the process itself, and they can easily slip back into their bad habits. And so I'd like to know that there was always going to be that kind of a challenge out there. I think Andrew would love to see 4 or 5 parties. I'm not as convinced that that's as healthy for a country like ours, but certainly nationally, I'm talking about 3 parties is a minimum that I think would keep everybody honest.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think my view of it is that, look, I think both parties have an incredible amount to offer our country. I like the idea that the Democratic Party focuses on issues that are important to people, education and healthcare and those types of things. But I also like the idea that we have had a Republican Party that focuses on the human spirit and owning what it is that you create and the ability to innovate, the focusing on the individual. Those, to me, those. I look back in our country's history and say, gosh, what would we have been like without Hamilton and Jefferson? We needed both of them. It's just that we've gotten to the point today where they've so perfected the system that it's only about a negative message. There's nothing that's coming out that is really talking about aspirational issues. And that's leading people to believe that our country is in big trouble. I think what you said a moment ago is true. This is still the best place to be, not only in terms of the world. This is the best place to be in the world at the best point in history. But our political system is not living up to it.
No, and I think it's had a real impact on our standing overseas. And that's unfortunate because we are a major superpower and we have big challenges coming at us from some rogue nations and some other big nations. I mean, we're not, China has its very definite desires, and we're going to have to learn to live with them because they're not going to go away, but we're going to have to be very protective of our own jobs and things. Russia is still out in North Korea. There are a lot of problem areas. It's one area where I give Joe Biden complete credit for holding the NATO alliance together and recognizing the importance of Ukraine and supporting Ukraine in this war, because Russia isn't going to, Putin
I
won't
agree.
stop there, and it will go on if we don't have that. But these are big issues that we have to face, and if they see us and perceive us as being a weak nation, a nation that can't get its act together, that is constantly fighting within, and of course we know now that they have all the technologies to help us feel that way. They intercede in elections to try to gin up all the controversy. Then that for them opens an opportunity to get in and try to undercut us in more substantive ways. And we need to be worried about that. We need to be concerned about that. We need to be aware of it.
All right. So, if people are interested in trying to make a change, there are some states that already have efforts, but there are a number of them that don't. What recommendation would you give to people to try to begin to start an effort?
Well, go to forwardparty.com. We actually are in every state. And when you sign up, you will be taken to your state's forward party, and you can start to get involved with them and what they're doing and trying to get on the ballot, or whether they're moving a particular ballot initiative, or they're supporting a candidate. I mean, some states, as you know, it's different in every state how you get on the ballot or recognized as a party. And in some states, you can run a candidate pretty easily as an independent candidate, and all they have to do is get 2% or 3% of the vote in the election, and then you become a party. Others, you have to get, as you said, 60,000 signatures to, if you're an independent in Arizona trying to get on the ballot. So
Hmm.
we're supporting those efforts throughout the country. We're particularly focusing on 12 states this year, Arizona being one of them, as a very important state and a state where we see very active forward party members. We have a great team there, and they're working hard on ensuring that every vote is counted and that everybody gets an opportunity to vote. And so that's something that I would encourage people to do. Go to forwardparty.com, and if you do that and sign up, you're not going to get 1,000 emails. You're not going to get dunned constantly. What's going to happen is it'll put you in touch with the forward party members in your state who are working to make these changes, and you can join them if it's for you. I mean, it's not going to be for everybody. We recognize that, and that's okay. We've been around. All of us have been around politics for quite a while now, and we're in it for the long haul.
Now, you can become a forward member and stay a Republican or stay a Democrat. Is that not correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I think that's
We
one of the
support
things that
we
makes you such
support
a unique
Republican,
party.
Democrat, Independents as long as they agree with our principles.
And again, I'm going to go back to those principles because what I love about them, by the way, I'm a forward member. I'm a registered independent, but I'm a forward member. What I love about the principles is what you stated right up front, which is the first issue is about decency. It's about listening to people that you don't necessarily agree with and granting them the same thing that you want. We all want the right to be able to express ourselves, but you have to let other people express themselves as well. And it's okay that we have differences, but changing the system, that to me is the thing that the Forward Party is doing a yeoman's effort on in terms of changing the way this country works, changing the system so that more people can participate, so that unaffiliated voters are treated equal to others. And again, I think it's key as people sign up that they not think that they have to give up their party registration in a party if they don't want to.
No, they don't have to. It just has to be that they support the principles, and they're so broad but meaningful. I mean, we've seen an eroding of respect for the rule of law. We've seen an eroding of an understanding of the Constitution, and we can't let that go on. We need to continue to support that because those things make us what we are and who we are as a nation. And we're still that, shining beacon on a hill, or however you want to say it. I have had the opportunity to be an observer in a number of elections overseas. And when you see people who have the opportunity for the first time to choose their elected leaders, it just is amazing. They will stand in line in the worst weather for hours and hours to get the opportunity to cast that ballot. And that's what I said. We've gotten a little lazy about it. We kind of assumed that life was always going to be like this. It's not. We have to fight for it. Democracy doesn't ask a lot of us, but it does ask us to vote, to be informed and vote. And we want to make sure that everybody has that opportunity as well.
So you went beyond just voting. You actually became again governor, and you had an illustrious career. Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, I loved being governor. It was just it was a great job here in New Jersey because I love the state. There were things I wanted to do, and the New Jersey governor at that point was the most powerful because of some constitutional things that you had, powers you had. And I think there are one or two other states that now have beginning to catch up with us. But you had your own team. It was your own cabinet. There was no other statewide elected official when I was governor. So you didn't have people who were in the Secretary of State's office or the Attorney General's office who wanted your job and was working against you. The people knew who to blame, that's for sure, because you did appoint everybody. But it meant you had a team that you could really work with and get things done. And that made it just an enormously challenging but satisfying job.
When you first decided to run for office, was this just something that was expected in your family or where you came from, or was it a challenge? Did you have to go through the rigors of what most people would have to go through if they ran?
Oh, it was a challenge, all right. No, it was not expected. My parents never ran for elective office. I had one brother who served in the state assembly for a brief period of time until he called them all monkeys in the zoo, and that was the end of his getting any bills posted. But he was so disgusted by the way they weren't working to solve problems that he tended to mouth off a little bit. But that was the end of him. And I had a three-way primary. I had run for the United States Senate in 1990. Understanding I wasn't going to win, just hoping I wasn't going to get blown out of the water the way the previous candidate who had run against this incumbent senator had been, what happened to her. But it was a way to get to know the state because as small as New Jersey is, it's very different. The South is always trying to secede from the North, and now we're finally getting people to recognize there is a central Jersey. We almost talk of North and South. But anyway, that was a way to spend more time across the state. And since I unexpectedly did a whole lot better than anybody thought I could possibly do, it gave me the legs to keep going. And I ran for governor because I really didn't like what was happening in the state. And it was the first time, when I won, it was the first time an incumbent governor had been defeated in a general election since the Constitution had been rewritten in 1947. So it was definitely a gamble, but I knew what I wanted to do, made a pledge and promises, and actually we got them done.
What was your favorite moment, either in office or in the cabinet?
I was governor. Because in governor, you choose the issues and you really can get things done. As a cabinet member, and I'd had a cabinet, so I understood this pretty well, you serve at the pleasure, and you're not making policy. It's up to the principal to do that. You try to give them your best advice. If you think they're making a mistake, you tell them as gently as you can. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that decide, and you salute and do it, or you decide that you're going to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, the point that you made, I definitely was unexpected to win. When I first ran, I ran in a 3-1 Republican district. I was a Democrat in the year of Ronald Reagan, and nobody thought I could win. I just knocked on more doors than the other person, who, by the way, outspent me about 3 or 4-1 as well. When I look back on it, I think I was 24. She was more qualified than me. But it's the most fun I ever had. I loved being in office. I recommend it to anyone who wants to. Unfortunately, I think it's becoming more difficult for people because of the fact that 40% of our country is now registered as an independent because they don't want to take part in the more partisan efforts of partisan politics. But I still recommend it. Do you feel the same?
Oh, no. It's a privilege to be able to do. It's a privilege we have in this country to be able to serve like that. Of course, you and I did the executive branch route, which I really like as adverse to the legislative. I don't think I have the patience to work through the legislative branch were I in it, to do what. Well, anyway, I love the executive branch.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so I just want to say thank you very much. I not only want to say thank you for coming on our show. I appreciate that. But Governor Whitman, this effort that you're doing with the Forward Party, again, I know the risk. I also know the work and the effort that you have to put into making something like that happen. It's so important for our country, maybe the single most important issue that we can focus on. And I just want to say thank you.
Well, this is the time. This really is the moment because, as you pointed out, the number of disaffected voters, the people who are independent or non-aligned now, who are saying a pox on both your houses to the two parties. And with the challenges that we're facing and the crazy things that are going on, this is the moment. And we've got to get it done now. So that's why we're completely dedicated to this.
All right.
But thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you, Governor Whitman. Thanks for listening today, especially if you listened all the way to the end. Governor Whitman is definitely part of that American spirit that we want to try to advocate for here. If you like what it is that we do, we recommend that you subscribe, but we also want your comments, even if you disagree with what we have to say. Now, I read every one of those comments. Some of them are pretty vitriolic at times, so I don't respond to all of them, but nonetheless, I do read them, and I do take them serious and want to try to learn from them. So your comments are deeply appreciated. Also, if you want to become a premium member, go to optamerican.com/premium. It's the way to be able to get this content without any ads. And also, we have a number of other benefits that we give our members. Either way, thanks so much for being here today. Thanks for being a part of the Optimistic American Show. And again, if you have more interest locally, go to savedemocracyaz.com, where the local effort for reform is being run. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now, help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.